Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Today we welcome Alberto Coll, Director, Global Engagement, Vincent de Paul, Professor of Law, to discuss critical developments in US politics and global affairs. We'll cover Wisconsin's Supreme Court election, the Congressional race to replace Mike Waltz, President Trump's new tariffs, and the high-stakes meeting between Steve Witkoff and a senior Russian negotiator, Kirill Dmitriev. What do these events signal for the future of US policy, trade, and diplomacy? Professor Coll, welcome to TVP World, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you.
Delighted to have you, sir. So let's start with Susan Crawford. So she has just won a place on the Supreme Court, Wisconsin Supreme Court. Talk us through that process. Was it a surprise that she won?
I'm not really surprised. Let's keep in mind that Wisconsin is very clearly what is known as a swing state. Democrats and Republicans are very evenly divided in the state. So, for example, Barack Obama won the state of Wisconsin in 2012. Donald Trump won the state of Wisconsin against Hillary Clinton in 2016. Joe Biden won Wisconsin against Donald Trump in 2020. And then Donald Trump won Wisconsin in 2024 against Kamala Harris. So it's a very evenly divided state. And the Democrats were very motivated to support Ms. Crawford, now Justice Crawford. And they turned out their people. This is really the key in Wisconsin elections. Which party has the greatest enthusiasm, the greatest energy to bring out their voters? Democrats are still very, very much upset about their loss to Donald Trump 5 months ago. And they wanted to make this election a verdict against the Trump administration, and they succeeded.
Understood. Now, much is being made of influence by Elon Musk, but also George Soros and Illinois Governor Pritzker were involved in supporting Susan Crawford. How much of a difference did these three players make to the outcome?
Well, all of them contributed lots of money. I mean, particularly George Soros on the Democratic side and Elon Musk on the Republican side. Musk got the greater degree of notoriety. But the fact is that a lot of these races, and the one in Wisconsin is an example, are funded by very large donors from both parties. Musk, of course, is the most famous, but Democratic donors like George Soros, through political action committees, donated millions and millions of dollars to this race. And that has become a regular feature of American politics in these so-called key races, which are highly symbolic, and where these huge donors, whether Musk or the Soros, people at that level, want to send a statement and make a political statement.
Understood. Now, the Supreme Court in Wisconsin has a liberal majority of judges. How do you think the laws might be changed in that state as a result of this?
Yeah, so the key issue that you want to watch out for is what is known as redistricting. So in the United States, the state legislative assemblies of the 50 states are the bodies that draw up the electoral districts, including the districts out of which members of Congress are voted. And there are major battles all the time in various states over the maps of these electoral districts. There's an old term called gerrymandering, by which, let's say, if a particular party controls the legislature of a state, they will draw all the electoral districts in that state so as to favor their political party over the other. And they do that, for example, by, let's say, if the Democrats control Wisconsin's legislature, for example, they would draw maps, every 10 years based on the census. But they would draw these maps so as to bunch all the Republican voters in one district and then dilute Republican voters in those districts so that Democrats would win those seats, so as to increase the number of representatives from their state that are Democrats. The Republicans play the same game. But the reason that this election was so important is that often these cases are litigated before the state Supreme Court. And if the state Supreme Court happens to be, in this case, liberal, leaning towards the Democratic Party, they're going to be more sympathetic to a pro-democratic redistricting scheme than if the court were in the hands of a conservative pro-Republican majority.
Understood. Well, we'll be watching to see what happens.
That's what this fight was all about.
We'll be watching to see what happens. I'd like to move on now, if I may, to a visit by Kirill Dmitriev. Well, it's a talked-about visit, and there's a bit of lack of clarity on whether he's actually in the States at the moment, but he's a senior negotiator for President Putin, and the talk is that he's going to be meeting Steve Witkoff, his counterpart on President Trump's team. What do we know, A, about his visit, and B, why sanctions against him were lifted to allow him to come to the United States?
So people need to understand Kirill Dmitriev is one of the smoothest, best skilled negotiators that President Putin is deploying in this series of negotiations with President Trump over Ukraine. He speaks flawless English, has a background in Goldman Sachs, various financial institutions in the private sector, knows very well how Europeans, how Americans see the world. And he definitely is here in order to try to persuade Steve Witkoff to push the idea that for Russia to agree to President Trump's peace proposals, the United States needs to drop economic sanctions on Russia and particularly pressure the Europeans to drop their sanctions against Russia. And that's what this is about. Russia, even though militarily is winning right now on the battlefield, at the tactical level, I'd say they still don't have a strategic victory in Ukraine, but at the tactical level, they seem to have momentum, some momentum right now. But the Russian economy is hurting very much from the impact of sanctions. Sanctions are taking a toll over time, and the Russians are very eager to have these sanctions lessened considerably. And the message to Trump is going to be, if you want a peace deal, you have to make sure that the sanctions are dropped, and you got to make sure the Europeans drop theirs, because, of course, the European Union has quite a bit of economic heft when it comes to sanctions against Russia.
Understood, but that still leaves us with the question of why Dmitriev was allowed to travel to the United States when he is a sanctioned individual. Why was an exception made for him, and why wasn't this discussed in Saudi Arabia like the earlier talks have been?
I think the Trump administration is very eager. Some people would say too eager to show the Russians that the Trump administration is friendly, is trying to act as a mediator. And this was a gesture, a way of saying, look, we will issue a waiver on sanctions against you so that we will treat you as a negotiator, and we will leave the climate of hostility towards Russia behind. It was a symbolic message, and it was a way of trying to soften the negotiating environment and trying to position the U.S. supposedly as a neutral mediator.
Do you see the U.S.'s position at the moment as a neutral mediator? Because many, looking at what's going on, would suggest that actually President Trump is more pro-Russia than pro-Ukraine.
Well, you know, this is a very contentious issue that you have raised quite legitimately. Many people do see President Trump acting as pro-Russian. On the other hand, you have to keep in mind that, you know, if the United States is going to play some kind of a mediating role, it has to make some gestures towards the Russians to indicate some kind of a good faith willingness to treat Russia as a legitimate player in this process. and to drop the kind of hostile rhetoric and stance that the Biden administration had adopted. I'm not saying that this is going to work. I'm just trying to explain to you how the administration's top officials explain this. They say, if we're going to mediate a peace with Russia, we cannot continue while we're negotiating with them to sanction them and to call them names and to act as if they're going to have to make all the concessions. So that's the rationale. Again, it's not clear whether this is going to work. President Putin, I believe, is going eventually to ask a very high price. And that's going to be really the hour of decision when the United States is really going to have to decide whether to continue pushing this process along without further pressure on Russia.
Understood. Well, I think you'll agree with me, Professor Coll, that good faith is required by all parties for any agreement to succeed. Thank you very much indeed for sharing your analysis with our audience. Have a good day, sir.
I'm delighted. Have a good night.
Thank you. That's all from us in this episode of World Talks. Goodbye.